Hello and welcome to Minds Between Languages. This special episode is hosted by Adolfo Martín García from the Universidad de San Andrés in Argentina. The episode features a roundtable discussion on methods in cognitive translation and interpreting studies, which was held in Santiago de Chile on the 7th September 2023, during the 4th International Conference on Translation, Interpreting and Cognition. The guests in this episode of Minds Between Languages are Elisabet Tiselius, Michaela Albl-Mikasa, Michael Carl, and Defeng Li. Elisabet Tiselius is an Associate Professor of Translation Studies with a focus on interpreting at Stockholm University in Sweden. Michaela Albl-Mikasa is a Professor of Interpreting Studies at the Zurich University of Applied Sciences in Switzerland. Michael Carl is a Distinguished Professor at Kent State University in the United States. Defeng Li is a Distinguished Professor of Translation Studies at the University of Macau in China.
Good to see everybody again. Hope you're having a good time. So we're going to try something new today. I don't know if you share the view that sometimes the most interesting things that happen in the conference are the things that happen outside the formal talks, right? You get together, over lunch or, during the coffee breaks or at dinner, and very, very interesting conversations spark that go beyond the more pre-structured type of discourse that we have when we are dealing with typical presentations. So we reasoned, well, why not try to factor that into the program, right? And that's what we're going to do today and what we're going to do tomorrow, also in our second roundtable discussion. So the idea today is to have a completely unrehearsed, spontaneous, free-flowing conversation around methods. All right? The methods that we use to explore cognitive aspects of translation and interpreting. And the people that you see sitting around me, they represent, they span, they cover a wide range of approaches and topics and forms of expertise. So that's the idea. They don't know what I'm going to be asking them. I don't know what I'm going to be asking them. And you don't know that you have to ask them questions as well. So this should be quite all right. So to our distinguished panelists, when it's your turn to talk, please hold your microphone and hold it close to your mouth so that our team of interpreters here can hear you properly. And here we go. The theme for this panel is methods we live by. Yes, I know, it's a shameless ripoff of a very famous book you've all read, right? But that's what we do. I mean, we rip off from the best, right? And but the idea is whatever we glean, whatever we imagine, whatever we understand, we learn about cognitive aspects of translation and interpreting is guided, determined, biased sometimes by the methods through which we lead our inquiries. So first of all, I would like to ask each of our panelists to very briefly just state the main methods that they work with. Just a quick warm-up question for all of them. And maybe we can first introduce them, although they need no introduction. So join me in welcoming with a warm round of applause Professors Defeng Li, Michael Carl, Michaela Albl-Mikasa, Elisabet Tiselius. Elisabet, why don't we start with you? What do you do and how do you do it?
What do I do and how do I do it? Well, I study interpreters and the cognition of interpreters, both conference interpreters and public service interpreters and sign language interpreters. I am a firm believer in good methodology for that study. And I'm sorry, it's making a noise. Okay.
Can you say something? Yeah.
Okay, so that's better. Yeah. And I don't think that it's difficult to say which methods do you use. I think it's better to say that what have I used, and then we can come back to whether it worked or not. But I have used questionnaires. I have used eye tracking. I have used different types of categorization and counting enumerations, and I don't know how to. I don't know exactly how to label that, but and of course the role plays that you've heard me talking about, video recordings and as I said, eye tracking. Let's stop there, and I'm sure I'll come back to things I have forgotten. Scales, of course, they are part of questionnaires, but scales. Yes.
Thank you. Michaela, what about you?
Okay, so I come from conference interpreting and from qualitative research, but I was thrown into a big project, into the CLINT project, which many of you have heard about, where the interpreters, the translators, and the neuropsychologists work together. It's a truly interdisciplinary project. And all I wanted to do is know more about the impact of ELF on cognitive load of interpreters, processing, and performance. And I never thought it would, get that big, but it did so. I worked together with Maureen Ahrensberger-Dahl, who did the translation part. I did the interpreting part with my team, she with her team. And then we had the neuropsychologist. And so I was virtually thrown into a multi-method project where we have the full battery that you can imagine. I mean, we have performance-based methods, of course, and then we have the behavioral methods. We have the physiological methods. We have what's the fourth category of the self-report, the introspective methods. We have the full battery, and I had to get my head around it. Much of it was quite new for me, especially the quantitative part, the experimental part. I never ventured into statistical analysis. I left this to Anne-Catherine, who is our postdoc and who loves statistics. And so we were very lucky for her to take this part on. But I had to really, get a glimpse of all of this and to find my way into it and to see how it all comes together, how it can help us answer this one question that I was interested in.
I'm sorry, but I forgot that both you and I have studied expertise using in-depth interviews. Yeah. So you wouldn't perhaps think that you would tap into cognitions through in-depth interviews, but we both tried that.
And we are both, or at least I, but I think that I speak for you as well. We are always happy when we hear people make a point of the fact that qualitative research can bring a lot to the way we look into cognition. And I mean, Daniel Gilles, he keeps making this point, and I think he's very right.
Phenomenal. Thank you very much. Michael, tell us a little about the methods you work with.
Okay, so maybe I can start with telling what I studied computational linguistics and got involved in machine translation in the Eurotrap project in the '80s. And that this was basically a rule-based system. And then I got this research position working on machine translation, natural language processing as a computational linguist. And then there was this idea that, this rule-based systems turned out not to work very well, rule-based machine translation systems. And there was this idea that machine translation systems should be designed in the way humans translate. And the idea was then to chop up, instead of decomposing texts into words or sentences into words and doing all this deep analysis, the idea was then to do this in this example-based machine translation approach. The idea was the idea was that translators would chop up the text into chunks and translate those chunks into the target site and rearrange this either mentally or somehow. And I tried this for a couple of years, whether this works better for a machine translation approach. And then I got this opportunity in Copenhagen where where Lykke Jacobsen had this I2IT project with an eye tracker and keylogging and so on. And before this, we were always assuming that humans would chop up texts into chunk and translate them and then rearrange this somehow. And there I saw the chance to really investigate, to look at how translators really translate. How do they actually produce those texts, and where do they look at text? What do they take in as information? What do they write out, and so on? And so this was an awesome possibility for me to better understand what happens in the mind of translators. And yeah, so that's why how I came into this area about 10 years ago, a bit more, 15 years ago maybe. And since then, collected all these data with the eye tracker and the keylogger, and we have this Translog2 program to record keystrokes, and with an eye tracker, I created then a big database where we we can upload all these process data and analyze this. And we have produced quite a large number of studies and reports on how this database works, and our findings and so on. And yeah, so this was how I came into this field, and it was mainly based on these ideas. Now that I said, with this behavioral traces of investigating behavioral traces to figure out what happens in the mind of translators.
I really like that figure of traces, right? Because I mean, the mind itself is imperceptible, right? I mean, you can't see the mind, you can't smell the mind, you can't touch the mind. So there are traces that we can actually measure. I wonder what are the traces that you are after, Defeng, and how you try to chase them.
Thank you. I also want to thank Catherine, actually. She prepared me very well for this talk now. During the tea break, she was talking to me. So basically, I started as someone doing translation education, because I have to do my PhD in language education at University of Alberta in Canada. So when I got a job at Chinese University of Hong Kong, I used my methods there. My training as a education translation, so I did lots of work. In terms of methods, I used questionnaires, interview, focus group, ground theory, journaling, as all these sort of research instruments to get the data and really study both translation students, translation teachers, professional translators, translation agency administrators, like all these people, how they look at translation education, what are the discrepancies between the training in the university and also the real world. And then because of my background in education and the training I had in database, the empirical research, so I was attracted to translation process research. That was the term for cognitive translation studies back in the 90s, I think. So, right, so I started to use synchronous protocols as the main research method to study the process of translating. I look at the subtitling, I look at the, for example, dialogue translation. No, translation in pairs, dialogue translation versus monologue translation, like they translate by your own. So that I got started in translation process research. And then I think because of the sort of criticism about how we're not able to see the whole picture of the brain when we just have that signal protocols as one sort of a lens to look at the black box. So I felt that the area sort of became quiet a little bit, and then I was attracted to another field of study that's corpus-based translation research. So I did a lot of work in using corpus to analyze translators' style, to compare how for example, the translators may differ in terms of their style when they are translating the same source text, and how their translator style may differ from their style as a creative translator. So I was able to find many cases of translators as well as writers even for my research. So that's my sort of second major field of research, that is corpus assisted translation, research of translators. So there I mainly use corpus linguistics corpus as the methodology. And then I was at the University of London, SOAS, for a few years, and then when I came back to the University of Macau, as the eye tracking was very much on the rise as a major or important research tool to study translation cognition. So I picked up this area of research again, and also because of my colleagues, for example, Professor Michaela Albl-Mikasa is there. She's a top interpreter. She's interested in research, simultaneous interpreting. So we work together for all these years. In terms of methodology, I think if we speak of like a methodology for translation cognition, we can say there's a psycholinguistic approach where we use a think-out purpose. We can speak of corpus methodology, so I think Michael is expert in using corpus to analyze translation process. We also have behavioral approach like eye trackers, translog and keylog, etc., etc. And there's a more like neural cognitive approach. We use FNIRS, FMI. So the tools that we have used at the University of Macau include like FNIRS, eye trackers, and now MRI. So in terms of tools, those were the tools I've used. But if I have one more minute, I just want to say in terms of methodology, I think we should think just beyond the tools that we're using to gather data. I think what is really something that I've been sort of advocating these years in regards to the three areas I've been doing, particularly the second and third one, the corpus based studies and the cognition studies. I think for me, the real thing is the sense making of these numbers, these data we gather with these tools. I have always think these tools are very powerful, they are very useful, but they are not the end. They are the real end is the interpretation of these data. So when we get these data, I think we really should ask ourselves a question: what do these data tell us really about translation, really about our brain? And right, so I think the sense making part is very important, also as an important part of the methodology. And I think that also speaks to, I think, many presentations, this conference and other conferences where we talk about how we should really construct models of translation and interpreting to guide our research.
Thank you very much. And I guess the first conclusion that we can already derive from all of this is, imagine if it's the translator's or the interpreter's mind where something that's within a room in a house, and maybe you can think of the different methods as windows into that, and each of these methods is going to give you maybe a glimpse into one aspect, but maybe won't allow you to see other aspects. And it's interesting to see that what we are doing is we are learning about the translators and the interpreter's mind by sometimes asking them what they think they were doing when they were translating, as sort of an introspective approach, asking them about what they think they know, right? More perhaps through interviews or questionnaires or surveys, by looking at the speed or the accuracy with which they perform certain tasks behaviorally, looking at the production of their process, in corpus-based studies, looking at biological correlates of their activity or parts therefrom. So all of this we bring together, and I remember back in the day, I had the very stupid idea that, okay, out of all these methods, some of them are good and some of them are bad. But then it dawned on me that if I ordered soup for dinner and I grab a knife to do it, there's something wrong. But it's not the guy's fault. It's my fault. I didn't realize that the tool that I needed for that particular task was a different one. When I asked you about the methods you work with, Elisabet, you hesitated. And you said, I can tell you about the ones that I've worked with. And it seemed to imply that some of them did not work for you, right? Can you tell us a little bit about the things, what you learned when you tried to use a certain method and it didn't really pay off?
I can try. But I would also like to elaborate a little bit first, because I also think that I can tell you about the methods I worked with, because similar to Defeng, you work with one method, it's very interesting, you get interesting results, but then you want to try something else, just as with the soup, or maybe next time you want to eat some cheese, and then you need another tool, so you start using another method. To get the cheese, and that does not mean that the first one was necessarily bad, just that you wanted to do something else. So I also think that it's important that just because I mastered, I don't know, retrospection or eye tracking or whatever it is really well, that does not mean that I couldn't try something else. So having said that, I think that every method I've worked with have also proven both useful and also, very despairing. Because that's the way with methods. You think that you have thought about all the variables, prepared your survey or your questionnaire so well, you've done the piloting, for questionnaires, for instance, because they are particularly difficult, I think. You do you do all the cognitive interviewing of the questionnaire, you do the piloting, you have asked all your colleagues about the approaches and the possible questions, and then you send it out and you discover that, I should have asked that as well, or actually these 10 questions that I asked, no need. And the 10 questions that I asked, it may even have increased my dropout rate because I had too many questions, and so on and so forth. So even when you think that this is, now I know it, no, you don't.
Very, very good message to relate to the younger members of our community, because sometimes the idea is I have to wait till I am an absolute master of this method to actually start working on it. What would your take be on it, Michaela? I mean, you mentioned pretty much the whole array of methods in your project. Do you have to be a full expert, an absolute master of each method to make it work for your project?
Well, I certainly wasn't. We started off, we had to file an application for our project because we wanted to have money, we wanted to have a grant. Okay, so we started off with the established methodology. So we wanted to do process research, and we wanted to look into cognitive load. So what do? You mentioned in your application all the various indicators that stand for cognitive load and cognitive effort, knowing very well that these are indirect indicators and that you don't get the full picture. So we thought if we have a multi-method approach and we collect so many data with different methods, we get at the phenomenon from different angles and perspectives, and then we put it together, and through triangulation we get a fuller picture and a more comprehensive idea of what we are looking at. And I thought this is fair enough, especially since Marie, she had a lot of experience from her previous project, was her project, translation process project, before the Ergotrans, capturing translation processes. So she had used especially the translation process related methods like keylogging, screen recording, all these methods she had used it. And then obviously we came up with the interpreting related ones, and we said we can look at cognitive load by looking at disfluencies, by looking at accuracy, etc., because these are indicators of whether or not an interpreter is suffering from additional load. But for me, I kind of went along because I knew this is the way to get money. But I work differently. Like when I did my PhD, I have more an emergentistic approach, as it were, an organic approach. Like I like to be led by the data. I have a feeling that the data calls for something. You know, the data is not dead matter. The data has its own way of wanting to be treated and has its own way of telling a story. So like, and it has its own needs as to what method you apply. For instance, when I did my PhD, I looked at note-taking for consecutive interpreting. And then I had these wonderful notes on a pad. And I thought, okay, so now what I do with it? I had to transcribe notes taken by an interpreter or by an interpreter trainee. It was full of pictograms and things. So how do I transcribe this? And then I also started to get interested because my supervisor, he had this social constructivist background, and he loved relevance theory, so I had to have a look at that. We discussed it, etc. And I suddenly realized this is something you can apply. And then I needed to apply the relevant theoretic toolkit to my data, to my node. I had to find a way of transcribing it, which I did. And again, in our project, I felt, you have all these established methodologies, but it's much more interesting to come up with innovative approaches to do justice to the data. Like when you see, we had this authentic ELF material, and we realized there were stretches when it was quite native-like, and then you have other stretches when it was very irregular and full of deviations. It was like sometimes these deviations were clustering. So we came up with this idea, what is elfish about the text? What are the elf phenomena? We came up with this idea of looking at elf dense spots and then analyzing those in more detail.
Elf meaning English
as a lingua franca. Or we looked at, we had different ways of looking at what exactly does an interpreter do when confronted with non-native English material. So we wanted to have a one-to-one way of looking at it. So we looked at the enrichments they do, again, applying relevance theory. So this is kind of my approach. Okay, you need the traditional methodological toolkit. It's described, it's established, it's well-founded, and you use this, a full battery, if it were, but then you have your data, which you collect by applying those methods, and then you start anew, and you try to see. Analyzing data is different to collecting data. So, collecting data, you have your established methodologies, but for analyzing data, find a way that does justice to this particular set of data. That is something I found, and then see whether it works.
No, and that's certainly an area where you start finding your own voice, your creativity, the challenges that arise out of that. And I wonder, talking about challenges, would it be fair to say that you devoted most of your time, your research time, in recent years to keylogging and eye tracking data? That would be fair, right?
Definitely.
Okay.
Yes.
Tell me one thing that you've learned these methods are good for, and tell me one thing that you've learned these methods stop at.
Well, they're sucking in themselves. There's always, as soon as you write a program, there's a bug, and that needs to be taken care of. And there's a saying, every 50 lines of code has one bug. So my code is a couple of thousand lines long. So but so I think that that every area of research becomes more formalized, more formal as it progresses, and I guess that's a sign of progress too, that it becomes more formalized. So we start off with exploratory questions, and then these become more special or specialized, and we find results, and we can constrain the area, and that we can formalize this and so on. And I think for myself, this is certainly the case in this area, and I would think in translation process in general, it is the case. No, and so that's what I tried to talk about yesterday also, no, where we have a formalized system where we can actually not only describe the translation process, but we can simulate it, and we can produce traces of translation processes and see how well that model actually reproduces these traces, and then we can evaluate it and see how well it works and so on. I want to say, well, I see very much a parallel there. So when I started with machine translation in the end 80s it was maybe. So we had this rule-based machine translation system, and for us at that time, it was not so much a system to produce translations, but to assess linguistic hypotheses. So we would state some, or the idea would be to have some hypotheses about relations between languages and so on, and then we would have a very stratification system with a very deep analysis of the various strata in the language and so on. And we would state hypotheses and try to see how well we can generalize this. And then most often it failed, and we tweaked this system, and then it worked somehow. And then another example came, and it didn't work again. And so it was more a system to assess hypotheses. It was a tool to elaborate theories or mini hypotheses about translation. So that ended maybe in around the mid-90s or so with statistical machine translation. These systems became much more functional. There was a much bigger increase of usability and so on. And this whole area of machine translation, which was for me a kind of an academic exercise to refine hypotheses and so on, it became an industrial project. So it became actually an implementation of something, and it became boring for me. So I was not interested in fine-tuning some industrial projects. And if you look now, what happens there, it has, well, the research is on a computer. I mean, nothing to do with linguistics. Transformer technology, no structure is there, no linguistic insight. So computer scientists may be interested in this, but not really actually. So, and I would assume something similar happens in our area translation process too. So we start out with hypotheses, exploration of the data and so on, and then we get some ideas of how we can actually generate this and refine this hypothesis, make it more formal, and eventually we will have a quite working system that reproduces the different facets and areas of the behavioral observations and so on, and it will become a formalized area altogether, I think. And I think we are in a kind of a point where we switch much more towards this very much formalized approach or future translation process, not only with the behavior data, but also with the brain imaging and understanding how humans work in general, and all this will very much change the whole area, I think, where we have
You go now from behavioral data to neurocognitive data. Both of those methods are part of what you have been working with, Defeng. And and you mentioned corpus approaches, right? You mentioned your educational beginnings, right? To what extent have you been able to integrate insights from different methods in a project? Or is it more like, for this project, I'm going to focus on this method, for this one, I'm going to focus on this? So to what extent do you favor more sort of one method per project or more holistic synergistic approach?
I think here, what I would like to say is, it's also a advice I often give to my PhD students. Remember, like just in the past, like 5-10 years, I do travel quite often, especially to the Chinese mainland. Quite often I get young teachers coming up to me and say, "Oh, Professor Li, I want to study this topic, and I want to use, for example, I want to use corpus as a methodology to study this topic. Could you tell me how do I do it?" You see the problem there. So I think the thing is, we need to remember, we start with the research question, and then we look for the method. Whether corpus is a good tool, or eye tracker is a good tool, or FNIRS is a better tool, I think we should really remember, we start with question, and then decide on the tools, on the methodology. So I think that's my sort of response to your prompt here. And another thing, because I wanted to say something like in response to your prompt to Elisabeth. My idea as to I don't remember whether that's for Elisabeth or for Michaela, is do we really start doing the research until we have mastered the method, the methodology, or not? I think for me, it's really important we have the basic knowledge of database empirical methodology. Because that's again like how I tell my students, I say you either go to the Department of Sociology or Department of Education, you find a course on like a methodology on social sciences or education. You get the methodology there because that is very important. For example, these days you can see many people work with questionnaires. Actually, questionnaire is not easy to design. It's not just you ask a question. Do you ask a direct question, or do you sort of go about it in order to get what you really want? Even the kind of language you use, right, in a questionnaire is actually very important. I remember back in the days when I did my PhD in Canada, like we spent like 3 hours just on the language we should use when we try to design a questionnaire. It's not a simple task.
Only 3 hours.
Well, yeah, but that's the kind of language you use. But then, right. So sometimes if we don't do the basics, we got the impression, oh, I can easily design a questionnaire. So I think that's very important. We need the groundwork. But then when we're doing research, for example, from our experience here at the University of California, we worked with the eye tracker. Actually, we basically taught ourselves by actually doing it, right? So we sort of become better as we work with the machine, work with the methodology. Right? Just like for example, at the very beginning, we were very excited by using pupil dilation as one of the parameters to look at the cognitive load. But then we realized, we did some of the studies during the broad midday. And then some in the evenings, you see the lights change. So then we realize, pupil dilation is not a good parameter here. And if we really want to use it, I think my colleague there, Victoria Lee, had a brilliant idea. So later on, when we did our second study, we simply make the consistent. Whenever we do the study, we close all the curtains. We only use artificial light. So that way we can keep the light constant, right? So then we make the pupil dilation more a reliable indicator of cognitive load. So we sort of learn, we become better, and so we don't wait. Yeah.
When I asked the question about whether you have like a one method per project, or whether you have a synergistic approach, you said we start with the question, right? And that makes a lot of sense. I wonder whether it is the case for you always that you always start with the question. I really mean it because in my experience, it's not always the case. I wonder if anybody wants to follow up on this question. Do you always start with the question, or is it sometimes you start somewhere else?
I was nodding vividly when Defeng said start with a question, because yes, I think that is what we, just as you, the example with the student who comes up and say, I want to use this corpus, that's I think a very common beginner's mistake, and not just for beginners, but a very common beginner's mistake because our department bought that really cool machine that I want to use. And because I want to use the really cool machine, I have to figure out a way to use it, and then I will adapt my questions accordingly, right? But the thing is that if we only want to use this really cool method, then are we really?
You still need the cool question.
Yeah,
right?
but exactly. But the why? So. Right? So why am I actually doing this? What will the impact be for? And with this, I don't mean to say that we can't do, baseline research. That's important as well. When we don't know what the impact will be, because baseline research is super important in translation studies as well. But at least we must have some idea about the questions I'd like to ask or the theories I'd like to apply. This is important as well. It's not just the methods, it's also a theory that I apply. And is my method relevant for this theory? So even if I want to use this really cool machine, I still have to sort of develop some kind of idea and question around it.
If I may interject just very quickly, sometimes you start with the question, and sometimes I think it's the most desirable thing to do. Sometimes you have the cool technology. It has happened to me that sometimes you start with the data.
Right.
You have a collaboration and somebody gives you a data set. And we have this, and we didn't really know what to do with it, but we have this data. So now you have to think about intelligent ways to query that data, which has already been collected. So you didn't have a say in the original question, you didn't have a say in the method or in the parameters, and ultimately you do have to go to the question, right?
I think your way works, but I'm just saying if you start with the question, it's more efficient, don't you think? You got the data, but you have to really follow around. You find the question or find the way to go.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
When I stumbled into this area of research 15 years ago, my question was very clear. My question was, what happens? How do humans produce translations? And this has been since then the basic questions that I'm asking. And for instance, there were hypotheses that the translator would first need to understand the source text before being able to translate. I doubted this right from the beginning, and the data that we have collected gave us right. So some translators, they start immediately translating without even understanding the sentence. So this is, for instance, one answer. So that was my starting point, actually. And well, since then, this job kept me.
If anybody from the audience has any questions or comments, please feel free to raise your hands and intervene. I wonder, Michaela, again, building on the vast repertoire of methods that you've worked with, how, I assume and I know that you work with large teams of people that have very different backgrounds, right? Logical backgrounds, even. In your experience, what is the most important thing when it comes to building a research project in which maybe you're the expert of one or two methods, but there's another method that maybe you're not the expert in, but the other guy is. How do you make that work? When you have this guy who knows this guy who knows this, but all of you have to work toward one same goal.
I think coordination is key. Like in our case, this is also something which we, I think, which was part of our proposal, that we said this is our project was a Synergia project. A Synergia project is by definition an interdisciplinary project. So this is a focus, this is a key point. So we had to really show that we were able and willing to cooperate and to make this interdisciplinary work project work. And what we did is that the young guys, the postdocs and the doctoral students, they worked very closely together. They exchanged protocols. They did the recruitment together. They came to each other's sites to do the piloting. We had meetings, very regular meetings, where we met all of us, and which were very, very exciting. Because these guys came from completely different perspective. And then there was Yankee, like the top neurology guy, and then. They found it very enriching to be confronted with studies where you have naturalistic data, where you have an ecologically valid approach. And that was very different to what they, kind of were used to. And they tried to take this over, and we showed them a way of working with more naturalistic data with lengthier bits of language, which they did. And vice versa, like they gave us insights into bilingual processing in the mind. So it was very exciting. And I think the excitement, the enthusiasm for it worked, the close cooperation and the exchanging of protocols and everything, scripts for programming, for statistics, etc. And also we had a research design whereby we had the same participants going to two sites, doing the tests in the two sites, so in the neurology lab and at our simulated workplace settings. To set this up was a bit of a challenge, but it was really exciting because first also it allowed us to triangulate the results. It's the same participants that did the EEG test and that did our test, and I think for the people involved, it was just immensely interesting to have this kind of exchange all the way through. And now that we are starting to have the results, I find it fascinating, for instance, to see an ELF effect or an ELF disadvantage in the performance data or in the self-report data. And then the neuropsychologists, they come up and say, well, we can't see it in our theta marker. There's no cognitive load there. But then again, they say, yes, we also did some self-report after each of our subtasks. And it shows that people report heightened workload in their self-report in the EEG studies, but we can't see it in our markers. So for us, this is a bit like saying, okay, is maybe brain techniques, are they maybe not the right technique to look into that kind of phenomena? Is it, you pitch it very high. You tell us this is the fascinating, which is it is fascinating stuff, but it's the top of the pops. And I would say, no, wait a minute. Our little performance-based studies are as exciting, are as interesting. And if I can, in different performance-based and self-report studies, I can see an ELF effect, an ELF disadvantage. It is something to go by. And you can tell me 100 times that you can't see it in your theta marker. There is still, this is an indicator for cognitive load or for cognitive effort. So it's kind of fascinating, and we are starting only to triangulate the results and to see where it leads us. But I think the fascination is something that kept us going a lot.
The fascination is an important point of working with people who know things that you don't. There's something that I want to build up on that you said, which is this. And I think it attests to the value of inter-methodological approaches. If you work only with one method, you run the risk of misinterpreting a null effect on a dependent variable as a null effect of the independent variable. So you're measuring cognitive load during a task. You have your theta marker, and you have no difference between conditions. So now you say, okay, there's no impact of cognitive load here. Is that the case? You were only looking at this aspect of it, right? And if you're only committed to one method, you run the risk of over-interpreting what that method is telling you about the phenomenon at large. It's only when you have multiple insights into that method that maybe you can have a more robust interpretation of whether something has an effect, whether something doesn't have an effect, or what most typically is the case, where that something has an effect, right? I wonder whether Defeng or Michael, you work with different methods, but you don't work with all of them. So, is there a method that you haven't sunk your teeth into that you would like to start learning more about or incorporating in your work?
Well, certainly, I think this neuro stuff is very interesting. I know very little about all this. So entangled, so difficult, and
What draws you to it? What do you find exciting about it?
well, I would think that if we see some behavioral traces, there should be a cause for this, and that can be sought in the brain activities. So if we get a connection between those things, that would be interesting, I guess, but also not really necessary, perhaps. But I would like to say a word, if that fits, about this word multi-methodology. And I think this is an outdated word. It is, I think it is not suitable because everything is actually multi-method. So, or say, people who use that word often don't really say what they mean by it. So if you have a questionnaire with multiple choice questions and with open questions, is that multiple method? If I write a program, I write a for loop and a while loop. Are these different methods? Are my programs multi-method then? So without specifying what people actually mean by this, it doesn't make sense at all, because everything is multi-method in that way. And so I would think it makes much more sense to talk about. So I understand multi-method. People make this distinction between qualitative and quantitative, and they talk about qualitative data and quantitative data, but this doesn't make sense either to me, because data is data. You can look at it from a qualitative point of view or from a quantitative. You can count stuff in there, or you can assess what kind of concepts are there, or whatever your quality is. But I think I would think so. Maybe I guess you disagree. But
Yes.
yes. Okay.
Slightly.
Some disagreement. I love it.
Yeah. No. So I think it makes more sense to talk about exploratory research and hypothesis-driven research. That would bring the stuff much more to the point, what you're actually doing, instead of talking about quantitative or qualitative. No, I mean there is no really a fixed boundary even between exploratory and hypothesis-driven, but I think that would make it much more clear.
I see that point. The point, maybe Michaela, if you want to follow.
Right. I think I have two things to say on this. I think if I remember both things, I think first of all, I think it's really when we do the research, when we've got the data, I think it's important that we would look at the data more quantitatively, do the numbering, the calculation. But at the same time, I think we should also, because translation and interpretation is such a complicated phenomenon, we also look at the individual cases. Like even I think tomorrow when I deliver my lecture here, I think we at the one point we look at the averages, we look at the means, but also even just for neural images, we also look at individual subjects to see whether like the data from these individual subjects really agree with what we've got there when we're looking for the means, etc., etc., etc. So I think it's really important to combine these two. So that will put us in a more in a safer position to project whatever we want to say. So yeah, and then in terms of combining methodology, whether I've tried everything, I think basically it seems that I've tried everything that is available, but I've got some on reflection. Now, in terms of research, especially in terms of interdisciplinary research, I'm more comfortable with the kind of research where the methodology are more or less within my ability and take full charge of the data collection, data analysis. I'm not so enthusiastic about projects where I have to rely entirely on other colleagues for part of the work, for example, data analysis. I'm not saying there's right or wrong, it's just my personal feeling, because that way I can control better the pace of the project.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. And I wonder, Michaela, if you have thoughts to share.
You mean on the controversial point?
Oh yeah. Let's go back to the
Yeah, I wouldn't say that you have data and then you can look at it from qualitative or quantitative perspective, because first you have to see. I would make this difference or differentiation between data collection and data analysis. So when you start collecting data, you have to already have an idea of what you are on about. So if you want to do qualitative research and you go ethnographically into the field, you do observation or whatever, or you really want to go to the very depth of a phenomena and ask people in an in-depth interview who really know about, medical interpreting or whatever it be, then you start off with a typically qualitative method. And then sometimes, you can do little quantitative calculations, like when I do my enrichment in analysis on my ELF data. I can either approach it from a qualitative way. I can count how many enrichments did they do when they interpret from an ELF source input, or when they interpret from an edited source input. These little calculations are nice because you can show there's a difference between ELF renditions and edited renditions. Or Anne-Kathrine's statistical analyses. They are fascinating, even though she alone knows what exactly she's doing, and it's quite fascinating. But the qualitative part is as fascinating to see what enrichments they do when, to what effect. But these are data which you can look at from both angles, but there are other data where from the very beginning you have to be clear about whether you take a qualitative or quantitative approach. That is that part. And the other part which you asked, the method that one would, as I said, I like to go from the research questions and collect data in various ways, which I apply various methods to see and get the data, and then see where the data takes me, and from the established method go to the innovative method. But the phenomenon I would like to look at, and but then comes the operationalization question. Like I would very much like now when we have the man-machine communication debate, and where we are left behind by artificial intelligence, I would really like to know what is the added value that we humans still have. For me, it lies in intuition and creativity. And this is what I would like to look into. But that is, again, a research question, not a methodology, because I don't know really how to operationalize it. So for the time being, all I can do is, again, do my little survey, ask people, what they mean by intuition, where they see the added value, how they apply it, where they feel they are creative, what they think is the difference between intuition and creativity, etc., etc. So I haven't yet figured out, how to really operationalize that concept and what methodology, other than the one that comes to my mind first, to apply to it. So if anybody has any ideas, please speak up.
Yeah, Elisabet, please. And we could go on for hours and hours, but we will not. So if you wanna, but there's dinner afterwards, right? So that's always a possibility. But please close us off here, Elisabet, with whatever reflections you have.
I don't think that we in translation studies made the division between quantitative and qualitative. It's around, right? And we have to sort of approach that. So whether it's quantitative or qualitative, that's not really interesting to me either. But what's interesting to me is that I don't like when people want to put me in a box and say that I'm a qualitative researcher or I'm a quantitative researcher, because I'd like to use the method that is suitable for the data that I want to look into or for the question that I want to answer. And whether that method implies statistics and a lot of numbers or a long interview that has to be transcribed and interpreted, that doesn't really matter as long as it answers the question I'm after. And I also think that it is important that we train ourselves in different methods. Of course, I will never be an fMRI researcher, or at least I don't think so. I think it's too late. But that the fact that I have used certain methods does not mean that I cannot go ahead and try others. For the methods I like to use, I'd really like to figure out how we can do the fMRI with really having the F in the fMRI. So can we devise a study where we can actually look at interpreters at work? The postdoc student I now have in Norway did a research study in South Africa where she used PET scan to look at sign language interpreters at work. But with PET scan, you know that you have to inject a little isotope, a tracer, and that is a very invasive method. And we do have a problem with participants, right? So, and that also adds to the quantitative or qualitative question. There's only so many people we can harass with this. So if we want to inject a tracer, I think we will lose even more of our precious participants. But
you even need a nurse to stand by.
Oh yes, definitely. It was a huge project. But the fMRI could really be done, and so far the F and the fMRI has been limited. So can we increase the F?
All right. That's an ambiguous statement. Yes, no, I really like that point. You know, the very, 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 very first ever imaging recording of someone engaging in some form of translation, word translation, was actually a PET study back in the late 90s. I don't remember if the very first one was by Kathy Price or by Klein, but there were 2 or 3 studies in the very, very beginning, together with single word reading and things like that. And then PET disappeared from the intralingual reformulation theme.
And it should stay there.
And you don't want it back. You don't want it back. No. Okay, but thank you all for your insights today. I mean, this could be just like the beginning of the conversation, but I think that we can draw some conclusions here. I mean, the array of methods that has been developed throughout the course, the development of our field is quite varied, and it seems to keep on growing. It's interesting too that to see that there seems to be no approach that is irrelevant to some aspect of the large questions that we are interested in, which is learning about the cognitive aspects of these activities that we find fascinating. It's also interesting to see that there's a plurality of perspectives on things such as where do research projects start, right? And maybe there's not a single answer. There's just different possibilities, but maybe there are ideal ways in which we could think about that. And it's also interesting to see that there are different perspectives even when it comes to understanding or defining basic things such as what is qualitative and what is quantitative. Is it the data or is it the approach through which we tackle the data? And I think that in the differences, in the points of convergence and the discrepancies especially, that's where the richness of our field lies. Because if we were all in full agreement, I think it would attest more to our collective blindness than to any sort of virtuous consensus. So thank you for disagreeing, basically. That's it. And thank you all for being here. And if we may say goodbye to our panelists, Professors Elisabet Tiselius, Michaela Albl-Mikasa, Michael Tarf, Defeng Li. Thank you so much.